G20 India 2023. One Earth, one family, one future.
This is All India Radio. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on Raisina dialogue during India's G20 Presidency. The participants are former diplomats Shilkant Sharma and Bhaswati Mukherjee. The discussion is moderated by Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist.
The theme of this year's Raisina dialogue, India's flagship conference on geopolitics and geostrategic affairs, has a very interesting construct and a set of outlines which intensive conversations over the next 2 days will attempt to fill. The theme of the 2023 edition of the Raisina is provocation, uncertainty, turbulence, lighthouse in the tempest. So over the course of the next 3 days, more than 250 odd people, decision makers and thought leaders are going to be engaging in over 100 conversations in various formats to deliberate over 5 thematic pillars, which include neo-insurgence, which is geographies, domains and ambitions. Then the second one is amoral mosaic, which is contest, cooperate or cancel. And the third is chaotic codes, sovereignty, security, society. Then the fourth is pernicious passports, climate, commons and citizens. And the final one is grey rhinos, democracies, dependencies and debt traps. Now, this particular edition of the Raisina dialogue is especially significant because it comes in the year of India's presidency of the G20, during which time India will aim to move ahead in uniquely Indian ways to resolve some of the most pressing problems that afflict the world today. The attempt of the Raisina dialogue will be to provoke some answers that can serve as a beacon towards a resolution of issues of peace and security, global trade, food and energy security, and much else. What will India's approach be, and what would India be looking for as it steers this particular ship? I am joined by 2 distinguished guests, Ambassador Shilkant Sharma and Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, to help us understand some of India's priorities in this endeavor. Ambassador Sharma, if I may begin with you, what do you make of the Raisina dialogue theme of provocation, uncertainty, turbulence, lighthouse in the tempest? How will this help guide the G20 presidency year?
Thank you, Nilova. The theme actually rhymes with what an eminent Nobel laureate said for this Amritkal, that India is a city on the hill. For most of the countries in the world, they look up to India for providing, a way. And that has been the consistent attempt by the Indian government under the leadership of our Prime Minister, and our Foreign Minister has been articulating very well on the themes. The city on the hill, or this lighthouse in tempest, is a very powerful metaphor. And as the Italian Prime Minister said in her opening address, she developed this theme. That the way she developed it actually resonated with our own approach. Now, G20, when it synchronizes with this kind of geostrategic and geopolitical dialogue in the Raisina conference, we have 2 aspects. The G20 was totally statist. It's all formal governments. And the diplomats, they are bound by positions. So, India on the one hand is negotiating and traversing through these formal positions to come out with something which is for common good, which will lead to dealing with the problems which bedevil our societies and our countries. And in that respect, the global south takes prominence. So that is the India way in which they are traversing this difficult field where the diplomats come with formal positions. On the other hand, the Raisina dialogue has 100 countries represented, 2,500 participants, but they are not bound by these formal positions. So they are invited to expostulate freely on these matters, which are these 5 themes which you narrated. So the topicality of the G20, and it enervates this dialogue. And the third point which you mentioned is also very significant, that suddenly from this vast canvas of G20 and the intellectual dialogue of the Raisina dialogue, you have picked up the Quad meeting which our foreign minister today held and his quotations which you gave. Now, that shows something very tangible, very palpable, and he describes what requires Quad to do. So, these three together actually make a very good combination of the themes, which were those 5 themes. I would like to just mention one more point, which is that the first theme is about the domains and the sovereignty and ambitions, geographies and ambitions and domains. That actually spans out the challenges today. You have technology domain, which actually encompasses problems and solutions. You have geographies which are physical, where you have territories and countries and sovereignty. And you have ambitions. You have leaders who put the subjective factors into this whole melee. So how do you combine them? It would be interesting to hear the people in the Raisina dialogue talking about these intersecting points. It is an open question how Raisina dialogue will make sense of these problems and towards the end how they will conclude with some kind of way forward. It is important because talking for the sake of talking doesn't make sense. So it has to be coherent and directional. So that is what is the expectation from the Raisina dialogue, that the multiple participants and the diverse themes, how do they gel and lead to some kind of a coherent result with a direction. It's a vector.
Right.
So that's what I feel.
Ambassador Mukherjee, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji yesterday raised a couple of these issues in his address to the G20 foreign ministers. When he said multilateralism is in a crisis today, and in terms of preventing future wars and fostering international cooperation, which were its 2 major tasks, do you think the whole construct of this particular meeting is intended to provoke countries who are perhaps errant in some ways into doing something cohesive to help resolve a lot of the issues that have arisen in the world today?
Thank you, Niluva. I think the Prime Minister's message also indicated that in India's perspective, multilateralism has failed because it does not reflect the new global order. And because it does not reflect the new global order, you have diminished powers trying to control international peace and security issues. I say that because you have to put it in the context of the Quad. The Quad, on the other hand, is a grouping that reflects the New World Order. And as Dr. Jaishankar rightly pointed out, it has leaders who are not encumbered by the baggage of the past. And that links up with India's efforts in the past, which have been unsuccessful, along with Japan, for example, to reform the UN Security Council on one hand, and on the other, to find groupings outside the UN multilaterally, which would reflect the new global order and which would be able to play a more important role on international peace and security, as indeed the Quad, which is intended to ensure peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. The membership of the Quad, again, is very significant because China is not a member, and it is a pushback against a rising militaristic China. If you link it back to the themes of the Raisina dialogue, again, the Raisina dialogue, which is a geostrategic dialogue, is hosted by India. This is the 8th Raisina dialogue. It again shows India's growing clout internationally because earlier such geostrategic dialogues were only hosted by G7 countries. But the fact that India is presiding over the G20, it is also the president of the SPO, the fact that it was only yesterday that Lavrov met Blinken on a corridor of Rashtrapati Bhavan, both tried to say that it was a chance meeting. In diplomacy, one never knows what is chance and what is fixed, and it's better not to speculate on it. But the point is, it was their first meeting after the Ukraine conflict. And if you look at the themes, which are provocation, uncertainty, turbulence, lighthouse, and the tempest. If you break them down, the themes, they mesh perfectly with what we are trying to do in the G20 context, which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. In the Quad context, that is peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And in the Raisina dialogue, the problems raised by provocation, the problems raised by uncertainty, the problems raised by turbulence, and in my interpretation, the lighthouse in the tempest is India, because India is in a position to be able to, if the protagonists agree to have talks around talks to bring an end to the Ukraine conflict. So therefore, I would say that this is a very layered message that our Prime Minister gave. We have the G20, we have the Quad, and we have a geostrategic dialogue taking place just after the G20, coinciding with Quad Foreign Ministers meeting. And so at the end of the day, it would be extremely interesting to know what this dialogue has to offer by way of addressing the theme, and in particular the theme Lighthouse in the Tempest. For me, that is a beacon of hope, a light in a troubled and turbulent ocean, which perhaps the major players, including the G7, could perhaps hold on to as a possibility to find a way out on all sides, because there's no doubt that the Ukraine conflict has not worked out the way that the West thought, because it has deeply impacted their economies, particularly of the European Union, many of whom are now in a state of active recession.
I absolutely agree that multilateralism in the form of the United Nations has been quite pathetic. It has really miserably failed to do anything about any conflict. But, so my question is, these very interesting constructs that have been themed this time in the Raisina, I think the intention behind them is to try and provoke people into sitting up and thinking, why is this happening? Why can't we arrive at some kind of solutions?
Since the principal protagonists are here in India, and there's just G20 meeting, a Quad meeting, and now the Raisina dialogue, there could be a possibility of having some discussions both within the Raisina dialogue and outside, which could show a way forward during the Indian presidency of the G20 when the summit is held later in the year.
I'm just quoting Prime Minister Modi, and these are very wise words. He says about G20, he urged G20 to build consensus and resolve differences. And he said, we should not allow issues that we cannot resolve together to come in the way of those we can. So this is a constructive and forward-looking manner in which India leads. And he says, on the one hand, Prime Minister mentioned about the infirmity of the global system, where it was not able to prevent future wars, and it was not able to really foster international cooperation on issues of common interest, and how financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, all these matters, the global governance machinery has not succeeded. So to allow that, to get G20 to address these things, it is important that you don't allow one aspect to dominate everything else. And that was why India tried very much to get what was accepted in the Bali Declaration, to at least to recap that. But there are countries who are not willing to accept it. They say 6 months have changed. But things go down, things go south, things go from bad to worse. But it is incumbent on leadership to see what can be done to salvage. So for instance, again I agree with what Tota said, the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the meeting, even the short meeting between the US Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister is a good augury, because even jaw is better than war. And even if they air their differences, the fact that they are talking is the beginning of hope, because so far in this 1 year, the world is frozen in fear, because the two big powers with the largest number of nuclear weapons are not only not talking, their strategic dialogue, their strategic stability commitments are also frayed. So this is where this kind of a talk is important. And in the Raisina dialogue, what we should do or what should be done about that, the External Affairs Minister actually mentioned this in his speech. And he quotes Prime Minister Modi, and the goals of developing countries is to have food and energy security. These are among the most important issues for the global south. And then no group can claim global leadership without listening to those who are most affected by its decisions. This is very vital. Like, you cannot, in insularity, take a decision which throws the whole world into turmoil. And if you're taking those decisions, then reconsider, look over your shoulders what you're doing. So these are the challenges. And if the intellectuals present at the dialogue at the Raisina dialogue and the sessions at the Raisina dialogue, they can zero in on these problems which are thrown up by their differences or by their radical outpourings, That should be a positive way out. The External Affairs Minister highlighted the debt problem facing the least developing countries. Now, the debt trap, it is one of the themes. The debt trap, democracy. So, this is where the problem is. How do you deal with that? Growth, development, economic resilience, disaster resilience, financial stability, transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, and food and energy security. So these are the tangible issues which are bread and butter for the South.
Absolutely, these are the issues that affect the world, and as the voice of the global South, which India aims to be during this G20 year, a presidency year, the point is also that the countries which have sort of inflicted some of these problems, including the China, for example, needs to at least acknowledge that there is a debt issue which has resulted from some of its actions. Similarly, as the Prime Minister told President Putin, this is not an era of war. So you have to acknowledge that there is a problem before that problem can actually be resolved or dealt with in whichever which way. You can't choose to just walk around or pretend that there isn't a problem, because there is a problem which is afflicting the entire global community. Bhashuti, would you like to sort of take this one up, please?
I thought it was addressed to Sheel, but let me try and answer it. I think the issue here is, Niluva, that we have a problem that has been, in my perspective, jointly created by two sides and is also based on one side turning its back on pledges that were made on the basis of which a new charter of security was drawn up for the European continent post Cold War I. We are now seemingly in Cold War 2.0, where one side is increasingly being seen as a kind of proxy for a Cold War 2.0 intended to inexorably weaken a former great power whose decline has strategic implications and may also result in the rise of an implacable military power that is certainly not in India's interest. Under those circumstances, it has never been my intention either to apportion blame or to say which side is more responsible. The point here is they are fully aware of the problem. Their final aim is to weaken and bleed one former great power so that that power can never rise again. But they seem to be oblivious to the fact that in the process, they may make inevitable the rise of a more implacable major country, which would, in that event, be a threat to India's peace and security. So under those circumstances, we have to take a very layered approach to this issue. That's all I'm saying.
Sheel, would you have anything to sort of add to what Bhashuti is saying, in the sense that what is happening now within India's possibility and the realm of India's possibilities to do in terms of addressing these issues or trying to finesse some of the problematic areas and going ahead with trying to broker some kind of, even if it isn't at least some kind of a via media whereby a global economic stability can arise again and trade can resume at levels that were required post the COVID pandemic?
Nilova, what is important is that there is inclusive, action-oriented trust and a will to rise above differences. Because if you allow yourselves to be overcome by differences, nothing can happen. Now, this is an opportunity, this conjuncture of G20 and on the one hand, and Quad on the other, and then this intellectual discourse which the Raisina dialogue provides for. Here, what would be a possible outcome? That should be discussed. This is important. For instance, India has repeatedly said that even for this problem between the two big protagonists, the route is through dialogue and diplomacy and not through war. So, what are the implications of that? Those implications are clear. Now, one side doesn't accept what the other side is saying. But this is what in diplomacy we've always found. In the Cold War also, formal positions of the two sides, even before the far-reaching global agreements like on INF treaty or strategic arms limitations, if we were in Geneva, we were following it day in, day out, their formal positions were way apart. But then they were talking and then trying to bridge differences. So that process has to come today when they talk to each other and bridge differences and come to some understanding. And all these problems about the others should impel them to look at common grounds. Because during the Cold War, when they used to threaten about nuclear annihilation, we used to say, you have no business to threaten our lives, and you have no business to threaten our planet. And there was this enormous pressure on them. In New York City, there was a 1 million strong rally, again for nuclear freeze and nuclear test ban and all these things. Why? Because they wanted to say that, look, in your runaway competition, you should not threaten mankind. Same way today, if they don't resolve these problems, and as Bhajpati rightly says, that lead to someone else coming up who has scantest regard for whatever you have in terms of international law. Because remember what Xi Jinping said to his people, his army a few years back, that remember your red genes. Now what are these red genes? In college we used to read one of the invocations of those red genes, that political power flows through the barrel of the gun. Now is that what you are trying to remember? So if that is so, then where can be peace? So one has to know where each side stands, whether they are standing quietly to enjoy the other two fight so that they can emerge victorious and powerful, or they are actually genuinely trying to stop the warring parties. And this is the point which India has. India doesn't have an axe to grind. India wants to speak for the larger good, for the bigger common good. And it is to address these problems like climate change, for instance. And so let's reverse the gear and come back to where you can peacefully and constructively resolve these problems, rather than flinging yourself into an unending, disaster, a humanitarian disaster, killings. It's nobody's case.
I completely agree with all of these points that you're raising, but again, to bring us back to the point of the Raisina dialogue, which is again, considering that the Ministry of External Affairs is holding this particular dialogue, clearly we are seeking certain answers or certain ways ahead that are possible to, steer through these very, very finicky and very, very touchy issues that every country seems to now hold. The Chinese are on a particular trip, the Russians equally, the Western powers. Everyone seems to be moving at various different trajectories, and it is India's job at this point, or what India would want to do at this point, is to try and get them to come to as close a meeting point as possible. So is that a correct way of interpreting this whole thing? Would that be an accurate description, do you think? And I want comments, please, from both of you.
As far as I am concerned, Nilova, what you said is by all means the requirement of the time, that look at ways, look at points which are common, go forward, search for middle ground, and reach for some kind of consonance rather than dissonance. And so the themes like lighthouse in the time of tempest has to keep the light burning, But if you allow it to be extinguished by war or by warring talk, then how are you helping it? So you have to, in all circumstances, maintain the light, the torch. That is important. I'm talking like an idealist, but I know when things go bad, idealism helps. Because this realism and all this pragmatism about, as Lord Byron said, barking of dogs for their carrion, this will not work.
Sudeep, what do you think would be the best way forward at this point for Dr. Jaishankar and for India to be guiding these very, very touchy and sensitive waters, as it were? How best can we act as that lighthouse of hope?
Well, I think the themes which have been set up by the ORS, supported by me, for the Raisina dialogue, provide an opportunity for External Affairs Minister and for India to look at emerging ideas which could perhaps be innovative and which could show the way forward out of our intractable conflicts, which, as Sheil said, could actually extinguish the light of the lighthouse, especially if there is a nuclear exchange. Because the danger here is that if new and innovative ideas are not accepted on both sides, and the NATO is perceived to be seen by the other side as getting directly involved, then you can have a nuclear exchange, which is why possibly that Blinken told Lavrov apparently in the corridor of Rashtrapati Bhavan that the United States expects Russia to get back to the arms control commitments which they have now got out of publicly, Putin said in his statement, expressing his disappointment on various issues. So those arms control agreements also prevent nuclear conflict, and therefore the light in the lighthouse, which we must make sure does not get extinguished, can get extinguished if there's a nuclear exchange. So I would say that the Raisina dialogue provides us a welcome opportunity to look at innovative ideas coming outside the box thinking and to see whether they can be utilized by India to persuade the main protagonists, including those who are encouraging a proxy war so as to bring down the other protagonists, to see whether they can be in some way in a position to actually have a torch of light through the darkness, through the storm, to show the way forward. This is exactly what Rabindranath Tagore said when he, in his Bengali poem, Akla Chalo Re, when in his last verse he wrote that when the night is full of storm, it is our responsibility to show the light forward, even if you have to take out your own rib and set it on fire. But if it is the correct path, we do go down that correct path. And that message of Rabindranath Tagore actually illuminates the final theme of the Raisina dialogue in my perspective.
Thanks so much, Bhashwati. I think we've run right out of time, and thank you so much, Ambassador Sharma and Ambassador Mukherjee, for a very stimulating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Raisina dialogue during India's G20 presidency. The participants were former diplomats Shilkant Sharma and Bhaswati Mukherjee. The discussion was moderated by Nilova Roy Chaudhary, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.
G20 India 2023. One Earth, one family, one future.